Next guest says we're due for a recession. Here to explain why, Carlyle Group co-founder and co-CEO David Rubenstein. Is it the same call for a recession that we saw from Ray Dalio, where he was actually saying it's a 60% chance we don't have a recession over the next 2 years, but headline writers get a hold of it and love to do the 40% that we might? Where are you over the next 2 years, David? Greater than 40% or less than 40% that we have a recession?
I'm not any better at predicting a recession than most economists. Most economists and business people are pretty good at telling you why the recession occurred after it occurred, but not when it's going to occur. And I'm probably in that category. I don't know when a recession is going to occur. We have them on average every 7 years. We're now 10 years without a recession. That's very long. There's no guarantee there'll be a recession anytime soon. The U.S. economy is actually in pretty good shape. We're not an island, though, and there's no doubt that as economies in Europe and Asia slow down and go into recession, we can't completely avoid that. But at the moment, I don't see a recession in the imminent future. I think for the political people who care about this kind of issue, the issue is whether or not there's going to be a recession before the next election or not. When presidents run for re-election in a recession, they tend to lose. In fact, only William McKinley has run for re-election in a recession and won. So from President Trump's point of view and from the point of view of members of Congress, they worry about a recession before the election, and I think that's an important issue for them to worry about. But it's too hard to say whether it's going to happen before November or after November. But at some point in our lifetime, there will be another recession.
Okay. And we've heard, we even have cliches about this, David, that expansions don't die of old age. It's got to be policy mistakes. Do you see policy mistakes being made either by the Fed or by President Trump or Congress?
Well, the Fed, I think the Fed is trying to judge the data just like all of us are, and they're not superhuman. They make mistakes, and they can gauge things differently at times, depending on how the data changes. Right now, I think the Fed is doing a pretty good job, and I'd like to remind people that the Federal Open Market Committee, which really decides interest rates, is composed of now 10 people, usually 12 people. We don't have a full Fed. It's not just the chairman of the Federal Reserve who makes these decisions on interest rates. At the moment, it appears that the Fed is likely to decrease interest rates again this year. Most people would say by 50 basis points. Nobody knows for certain. If there is a 50 basis point reduction this year again, I think that will keep the economy in reasonable shape. But you cannot avoid a recession only by interest rates. If China trade agreement does not get resolved in some form before the election, I suspect it will not be good for those who are running for re-election. I do think there's a chance of getting an agreement, though, before the election.
When you say resolved and getting an agreement, are you talking about a deal light type of thing? That's what Tom Friedman was kind of laying out yesterday, that we've got to roll back our expectations.
Well, I believe that there are three parts to a China trade agreement. One is that the Chinese will buy more products from us. I think the Chinese will do that. It's just a question of exactly the amount. Second is our market access to China. And I think there's large agreement about that getting done. And I think with intellectual property considerations taken into account there as well, I think that can get done. The hardest part is when China is being told by us they have to change their China 2025 policy, which means that the government of China cannot really intervene and help the Chinese companies on 5G or artificial intelligence. That is really a challenge to the Chinese manhood, and they're not going to let us tell them how to run their government or run their economic policy.
Got to be a genderless way to say that, my friend. But you can deal with the male. I'm not going to touch that.
Okay, but let me just to finish on that. To finish on that point, I do think an agreement on parts 1 and 2 is possible, and we don't have to have the most comprehensive China trade agreement of all time in order to have an agreement with China. I think the markets would feel if we got an agreement on parts 1 and 2 and an agreement on parts 3 after an election, that still would be adequate.
Right.
Obviously, there are many different issues there.
Friedman is saying,
David, you're a Washington whisperer, and we did see President Trump. He's been unpredictable on this, but he kind of seemed to offer an olive branch this week in terms of that. Do you think he's kind of getting the message that you and Tom and others are talking about, or what happens next?
The president does talk to lots of different people, and I would say that he is hearing from people that some agreement is better than no agreement, and certainty is what the markets want. Markets do not like uncertainty. Right now, there's uncertainty about China. Give the markets some certainty, even if it's not comprehensive. I think the markets would respond quite well to it. And I do think the Chinese want to make a deal. The Chinese can't say, please give us a deal, we'll take any deal, because they have their own political considerations. But I think Xi Jinping and his senior leaders would like a deal, but it has to be face-saving. Neither the Chinese nor the Americans say it's the greatest deal in the world from their point of view. It has to be couched in a way that both sides win, and has to be very carefully stated publicly about why it's good for both sides. We can't brag about the deal being so great for us, and nor can the Chinese brag about it being so great for them.
You just wonder, David, whether wrapped up in an autocracy and communism is IP theft and not allowing other companies to really have a fair shake in your country, even though you get to export a lot. Is that part of the overall sort of communist way of doing it? Because we could never say to China, you got to become a democracy before we're going to deal with you. And that's kind of like what we're saying right now. You've got to change the spots on a leopard, and you can't really do that, can you? It's a totally different way of doing business than what they've been so successful with in the past.
Well, some people would like the Chinese to become a capitalist, pure capitalist country. That isn't going to happen in our lifetime, in my view. But I do think that the Chinese are willing to make some accommodations, as we are willing to make some accommodations. And I do think an agreement that is a partial agreement is better than no agreement. And I do think our own negotiators should take that into account. And I think the Chinese are willing to have a partial agreement, David, as well.
There are some people that think that system is inherently evil, and that if you do become even more powerful by 2025 with the system that you have, with internment camps for Uyghurs and everything else, Bannon and other hawks think that you are sort of consorting with, for lack of a better word, part of an evil empire, right?
To get something done in life, you can't worry about what people on the far left or the far right say. You have to get something done that makes progress.
We wouldn't have any oil from Saudi Arabia at this point, I guess, if we were in terms of human rights. Go ahead,
David.
We can't worry about every country's internal situation if we're going to get anything done.
Right.
Nobody is saying that China is perfect by our standards, but we can get a deal done with them, in my view, and I think it can be done before the election.
Right, David. This is Barry Knapp. A quick question for you: If what the motivation for doing a deal is primarily political on Donald Trump's side, getting something done before the election, why wouldn't it just be energy purchases, foreign purchases, and a currency agreement, which is a big visible statement that he can promote in his rallies? But trying to get something done on IP and something done on them cutting their capacity in heavy industry and all is something that the left could easily poke holes in. Someone like Elizabeth Warren could say, hey, this wasn't fail-proof. This was a bad deal. Why wouldn't it just be the former rather than something a little more comprehensive that you seem to be implying?
I don't want to make it say that the president is going to do something only for political purposes. He has lots of people in his administration who are not worried about the election as much as they're worried about getting a very good agreement. I'm sure he wants one, too. I don't think that any agreement the president gets will be one that Elizabeth Warren or people running for president will say, on the Democratic side, will say, wow, that's a great agreement. It's a good thing the president negotiated that. That's unrealistic. I think the president has to look at what is doable and achievable and what is a reasonable deal, and done it not just before the election, but in the near term. Forget the election. Getting something done in the next few months or next 4 months or so that the economy can get some certainty is what's the most important thing.
Let's get back to what we're talking about at the very beginning with you, David, and that was whether there's a recession. I mean, how do you explain or how do you live with inversions and low interest rates and the specter of this sort of historic move that we've seen? We don't know whether it presages something really scary or whether we can explain it in ways that aren't quite as bad.
Well, first of all, anything that happens in August in the markets probably has to be discounted because everybody's not trading in August and lots of people are on vacation. But secondly, the inverted yield curve, when we have one, it is usually a good indicator of a recession. However, we had an inverted yield curve for about 10 minutes. We haven't had it for a long period of time. When we had the last inverted yield curve before the last Great Recession, it was an inverted yield curve for about a quarter. So it doesn't necessarily mean because we had a 10-minute inverted yield curve that we're going to have a recession. And by the way, when you do have an inverted yield curve for some period of time, more than 10 minutes, it usually can take somewhere between 300 and 500 days before a recession occurs, so it's not an immediate indicator that we're about to go into recession. I also think that the inverted yield curve standard may not be fully applicable when you have negative interest rates in Europe, and that's a big factor that didn't exist in previous cases when you had an inverted yield curve.
So you are a big-time Washington whisperer, a terrible dancer, as we saw in the Obama administration, but a Washington whisperer. You do not whisper to a lot of Republicans, I don't think. Which Democrats are you whispering to right now? Just let us know.
Well, I don't whisper to anybody. I'm an independent, and I don't give money to any political party or any political candidate. And I talk to Democrats and Republicans all the time, and I talk to many members of Congress, and I don't really whisper to either of them. I tell people what I think, and I'm telling them publicly what I think, but as I am now.
You don't have a preference for who do you think is going to be in the next election, just out of...
I think President Trump is very likely to be the Republican nominee.
Hey, David, can you give us your take on corporate profitability right now and valuations of the market, given all the uncertainty that's out there?
Valuations are very high by traditional standards. In the buyout world that I know reasonably well, we are paying high multiples by traditional standards. Traditionally, we like to pay 7, 8, 9 times cash flow. We're now often paying 13, 14 times cash flow. Now, you can get away with that a bit because investors are willing to take somewhat lower returns than they were 10 years ago. We can still get very good returns in private equity by traditional standards. I'd say 15% or so, 16% annualized rates of return are still pretty good, but it's obviously be better if we could pay lower prices. Valuations are high, but I don't think it's so high that we can't get good deals done.
You said by traditional metrics, the difference here is that you're looking at interest rates being so low, and that's kind of something that's been pushing stock prices higher and higher.
And valuations higher.
There's no doubt that low interest rates help fuel prices being higher, and I suspect interest rates will get a little bit lower. Remember, our interest rates are high by the standards of people in Japan and Europe. Yeah. There are negative interest rates there. And it's an important point that everybody should remember. Low interest rates don't guarantee that you're not going to have a recession. There are recessions going on around the world in countries that have negative interest rates. So it doesn't necessarily mean because we have interest rates going down, the economy will prosper.
Yeah. David, what about the profitability outlook?
Profitability is in pretty good shape for U.S. companies. Obviously, some are better than others. And the private equity industry, the industry is doing quite well now, and we've been getting good returns for our investors. So I think profitability is quite good right now because we're in a pretty good economy right now. And I'd say if it continues this way, I think profitability will be good for the next several quarters.
Thank you for the Washington Monument. It's all open back.
We will make an announcement today about that. I don't know if it's been made yet, but there will be an announcement soon when it's going to be open.
Okay, when it's going to be open. Yeah, but you're almost done, right?
It is done. It'll be opening very shortly.
You know, I'm not saying you thought of this, but if Washington ever falls fully out of favor, it will be the Rubenstein Monument.
I doubt that they're going to be naming it after somebody with that last name, but thank you very much.
Hey, who else? That's why it looks so good, and it's all fixed. That was such a great thing, and we thank you for that,
My
David.
pleasure.
And I will suggest that, which could
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Completely.
My family will appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you.